I am Nia, 32 years old, and I build my wealth appraising and liquidating luxury estates for the elite. My family, however, always treated my career like a dirty secret, preferring to tell their country club friends I sold used furniture. But last Tuesday, I came home 15 minutes early to find my heavy wooden front door kicked completely off its hinges. I sprinted inside, ready to protect my 8-year-old daughter Chloe from an intruder, but the monsters tearing my house apart were my own blood. My 60-year-old father, a respected church deacon, had my little girl cornered while my sister ransacked my bedroom upstairs. I did not scream or cry. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and dialed 911. Before I tell you how I destroyed their perfect upper-class facade piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who mistook your silence for weakness. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta, my family was obsessed with image. My father, Desmond, was a prominent figure in our community, always preaching about family values and excellence. He demanded absolute perfection and submission. My older sister, Maya, was his golden child. She married a rich finance broker, lived in a sprawling penthouse, and looked down on everyone, especially me. I was the scapegoat, the college dropout who did not fit their pristine mold. When I started my own asset liquidation firm, I did it entirely on my own. I worked grueling 80-hour weeks, dealing with bankruptcy lawyers and auction houses until I built a highly lucrative business. But to my father and Maya, I was just the embarrassing relative who refused to conform to their standards. They never respected my boundaries, my home, or my role as a mother. That Tuesday started like any other normal day until the school nurse called to say Chloe had a mild fever. I left the office immediately to bring her home. I set her up on the living room sofa with a warm blanket, some juice, and her favorite cartoons. She was feeling drowsy, so I decided to make a quick run to the local pharmacy just 2 blocks away to grab some children's medicine. I double-locked the front door, set the security alarm, and drove off. I was gone for exactly 15 minutes. When I pulled back into my driveway, the sight of my front door made my blood run cold. The thick, solid wood frame was splintered right down the middle, and the deadbolt had been violently smashed inward. Pure maternal adrenaline flooded my system. I did not care if there was a gang of armed robbers inside. All I cared about was my daughter. I sprinted up the concrete walkway and burst through the ruined doorway, ready to fight for Chloe's life. Instead, the sight that greeted me was infinitely worse than any random home invasion. Standing in the middle of my living room was my father, Desmond. His perfectly tailored designer suit jacket was pushed back, and his usually calm, composed face was twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl. He was standing directly over the sofa, cornering my little girl against the armrest. Chloe was hyperventilating, clutching her knees to her chest as tears streamed down her flushed cheeks. She was absolutely terrified of the man she called grandfather. He was pointing his finger inches from her face, shouting at her, demanding to know where I kept the key to my office safe. "Tell me right now," he demanded, his voice booming through the room. "Where does your mother hide the property papers?" Before I could even process the sheer horror of my father threatening my sick child, a loud crash echoed from the floor right above my head. Heavy footsteps stomped aggressively across the ceiling, coming directly from my master bedroom. It was Maya. I could hear drawers being ripped violently from their tracks and hitting the hardwood floor. Hangers were snapping, fabric was tearing. "Where is that certificate?" she screamed through the floorboards, her voice completely manic. "Nia is hiding it somewhere in this mess." They thought I was still at work. They thought they had the right to break into my sanctuary, terrorize my child, and steal my confidential business assets simply because they felt entitled to my hard work. A younger, weaker version of me would have reacted with pure, frantic emotion. I would have dropped to my knees, cried, and begged my father to step away from my baby. I would have run upstairs and engaged in a screaming match with my sister. But my career in liquidating assets for desperate wealthy people had taught me exactly how to handle arrogant individuals who believed the rules did not apply to them. I knew that engaging with narcissists only gave them power. I did not say a single word. I did not announce my presence or scream for them to stop. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and quietly pressed the record button. I stood silently in the hallway, letting the camera capture the undeniable truth of their crimes. I recorded my respected community leader father looming over a weeping 8-year-old threatening a sick child. I kept the camera rolling as Maya appeared at the top of the staircase. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled, and she was clutching a metal lockbox she had pried out of my hidden closet using a heavy brass bookend. Her face was flushed with greedy desperation. 30 seconds of video. That was all I needed to secure my daughter's safety and completely dismantle their lives. I stopped recording, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and calmly dialed 911. I spoke to the emergency dispatcher in a clear, steady voice. I requested immediate police assistance for an active home invasion. I gave them my address and stated that 2 intruders had kicked in my front door and were currently holding my young daughter hostage in the living room. Only after the call was connected and help was on the way did I step fully into the room. I walked straight past my father, ignoring his existence entirely, and pulled Chloe into my arms, wrapping her in a fierce, protective embrace. She buried her face in my shoulder, trembling uncontrollably. My father spun around, his eyes widening in absolute shock. "Nia!" He stammered, the aggressive snarl instantly vanishing from his face as he frantically tried to put his polished mask back on. "We were just looking for something important. We needed to find some documents." Maya jogged down the stairs, clutching my ruined lockbox to her chest. "It is about time you got back," she scoffed, totally unbothered by the fact that she had just committed a major felony. "Give us the code right now. My husband needs these apartment documents for a major business deal, and we are not leaving this house without them." "You kicked down my front door," I said, my voice dangerously level, keeping Chloe tucked safely behind me. "You cornered and threatened an 8-year-old child." "Do not use that disrespectful tone with me," my father barked, trying to summon his usual patriarchal authority. "You are being selfish. Your brother-in-law needs this to secure his investment fund. We are family, Nia. Family helps family out." Before I could tell him exactly what I thought of his twisted version of family, the piercing wail of police sirens cut through the quiet suburban afternoon. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing down the street, until 2 squad cars screeched to a halt right in my driveway. Red and blue lights flashed violently through the large living room windows, illuminating the sheer terror that suddenly washed over my father's face. The great community leader realized exactly what was happening. The illusion of his perfect life was about to shatter. Maya dropped the metal lockbox on the floor, the heavy object hitting the hardwood with a loud, dull thud. "Did you call the police?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with sudden raw panic as the heavy footsteps of armed officers approached the porch. "You called the cops on your own family." 3 uniformed officers charged up the porch steps, their heavy boots crunching over the splintered remains of my front door. They entered my living room with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, their eyes scanning the chaotic scene. In that exact fraction of a second, my father morphed completely. The vicious tyrant who had just cornered my terrified 8-year-old vanished into thin air. In his place stood Desmond, the beloved community deacon. He quickly smoothed his expensive designer tie, straightened his posture, and adopted a tone so calm and authoritative it made my stomach turn. "Officers, thank God you are here," my father said smoothly, taking a slow, non-threatening step toward them. "There is a terrible misunderstanding happening today. I am Deacon Desmond from the First Grace Church just down the street. This is my daughter's home." The lead officer, a tall man with sharp, assessing eyes, looked at the destroyed front door and then at my father. "Someone reported a violent home invasion," he stated firmly, looking around the wrecked living room and noting the obvious signs of a struggle. My father offered the police a sad, sympathetic smile that he had probably practiced in the mirror for years. "It breaks my heart to say this, officer, but my youngest daughter, Nia, struggles severely with her mental health." He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "She is having a terrible psychological episode today. We came over to check on her because we were worried, and she locked us out in a paranoid panic. I had to break the door to make sure my granddaughter was safe inside. Maya seized the opportunity immediately. She kicked the metal lockbox under the edge of the sofa and pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my face. "She is completely unstable," Maya cried, putting on a theatrical display of fake tears. "We were just trying to retrieve my grandmother's heirloom jewelry. Nia stole it from me last week, and we simply came to get it back before she pawns it to fund her erratic lifestyle." I stood there holding my trembling daughter against my legs, while my own flesh and blood gaslit me in front of armed police officers. They were counting on me to react with pure, unhinged emotion. They expected me to scream, to call them liars, and to look exactly like the hysterical, unhinged woman they were describing to the authorities. They thought their pristine upper-class reputation would automatically make the police believe them over a single mother. But I did not raise my voice. I gently set Chloe behind me, shielded by my body, and pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. "You want to talk about mental health?" I asked, staring dead into my father's cold eyes. "Like the time you tried to force me into a psychiatric hold when I was 20 years old, simply because I refused to empty my meager college savings to co-sign a massive loan for Maya's new sports car. Is that the mental health episode we are discussing today, Desmond?" My father's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek, but he kept his fake benevolent smile fixed in place for the cops. "She is delusional, officers," he whispered, shaking his head with mock pity. "She does not know what she is saying." I ignored him entirely and handed my phone directly to the lead officer. I tapped the screen and pressed play on the video I had just recorded a few minutes prior. I made sure the volume was turned all the way up. The high-definition audio filled the silent living room. My father's booming, aggressive voice echoed from the small speaker, demanding the property papers and threatening a crying child. The video clearly showed him backing Chloe into the corner with his fist raised. Then the footage panned up to the staircase, showing Maya covered in dust, clutching my heavy metal lockbox. The video clearly proved she was holding a box of real estate deeds, not a velvet jewelry box. The three officers watched the entire 30 seconds of footage in absolute dead silence. When the video ended, the lead officer looked up and his demeanor had completely changed. The sympathetic, polite look he had initially given my father was entirely gone. It was replaced by cold, professional fury. He turned to his partners and gave a quick, sharp nod. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer ordered, stepping aggressively toward my father. My father's polished mask finally shattered into a million pieces. He sputtered and stepped back, his chest heaving with sudden panic. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, his smooth church voice entirely gone, replaced by arrogant entitlement. "You cannot arrest me for disciplining my own family. You cannot do this to a man of my standing." The officers did not care about his standing. The second officer was already grabbing Maya by the arms. She thrashed wildly and shrieked about being a respectable woman from a good neighborhood. She tried to claw her way out of their firm grip, crying out that her husband would sue the entire police department. But the crisp, heavy click of the steel handcuffs shutting tightly around her wrists was the single most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. They marched my sister out the front door first. Her designer heels dragged awkwardly across the ruined wood of the porch, while my nosy neighbors gathered on their manicured lawns. Everyone watched in stunned silence as the golden child of the family got stuffed unceremoniously into the back of a flashing squad car. My father went next. The officers did not give him the dignity of hiding his handcuffed wrists behind a jacket. They paraded him right down the front walkway, exposing the great community leader as a common violent thug to the entire neighborhood. He glared at me over his shoulder, his eyes burning with pure hatred, promising silently that I would pay for this humiliation. I did not look away. I stood tall, pulled Chloe tighter against my side, and watched them drive away. I spent the next 2 hours comforting my traumatized daughter, giving my official statement to a remaining detective, and arranging for an emergency locksmith to secure my destroyed front entrance. As I swept up the splintered wood and finally got Chloe to sleep in my bed, I thought the absolute worst of the nightmare was over. I thought my family had finally learned they could not trample over my life anymore. I was completely wrong. The real battle was just beginning. Just after 9 o'clock that night, heavy headlights swept across my living room wall, illuminating the dark shadows of the house. A sleek black BMW pulled up to my curb and parked aggressively, blocking my entire driveway. The heavy car doors slammed shut in unison, echoing loudly across the quiet suburban street. Out stepped Bradley, my sister Maya's husband, followed closely by a man carrying a thick leather briefcase, who oozed the specific type of sleaze reserved for expensive defense attorneys. Bradley was a 38-year-old finance broker who had always treated my very existence as an unfortunate stain on his perfect society marriage. He carried himself with the smug, unearned entitlement of a man who believed his race. His bank account and his background made him utterly untouchable. He did not bother walking up the paved path. He marched directly across my freshly watered lawn, ruining the grass in his designer loafers, and stopped at the base of my porch stairs. He did not ask if my daughter Chloe was okay. He did not ask why his wife had been caught on camera with a metal lockbox in her hands. He just looked down his nose at me standing on my ruined porch and sneered. "Drop the charges right now, Nia," he demanded, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You have completely lost your mind. Call the precinct and tell them you made a mistake, or things are going to get very ugly for you." I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, planting my feet firmly on the wooden deck. "I am not calling anyone Bradley," I told him, my voice steady and unwavering. "Your wife and your father-in-law violently broke into my home and cornered my sick child. They belong exactly where they are currently sitting, in a holding cell." The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase, but Bradley held up a hand to stop him, preferring to handle the intimidation himself. "You listen to me, you glorified scrap dealer," Bradley spat, taking a step up the stairs to try and physically loom over me. "Maya and I have a stable, high-income household. You are an unmarried woman running a junk-buying hustle out of a warehouse. If you do not call the police and drop this ridiculous case within the next 10 minutes, my lawyer here is going to make a phone call to Child Protective Services." He paused, letting the threat hang heavily in the air. "We will tell them you are an unfit mother, maintaining an unsafe, volatile environment for Chloe. We will say you are having a severe mental breakdown, just like Desmond told the police. We have the resources to drag you into court and bury you in legal fees. You will lose custody of your kid before the weekend is over." He smiled a cold, cruel smile, thinking he had me backed into an inescapable corner. He thought I was just the poor, struggling sister-in-law who would instantly fold under the terrifying threat of losing her only child. He assumed I would crumble at the mere mention of government agencies evaluating my life. He was relying on the classic intimidation tactics that rich, privileged men use to bully single mothers into submission. He fully expected me to beg for mercy and agree to whatever terms he laid out. I did not blink. I did not step back. I stood absolutely perfectly still, refusing to give him even an ounce of the fear he was looking for. I looked at the aggressive stance of his lawyer. Then I looked back at Bradley. I let my eyes slowly travel down his perfectly tailored suit, tracing the line of his sleeve, until my gaze landed squarely on the heavy gold watch gleaming ostentatiously on his left wrist. It was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of his immense wealth and untouchable status. "Go ahead and call them, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely void of fear. "Invite them over. But before you invite government agencies to look deeply into my financial stability, you might want to figure out how you are going to explain your own." Bradley frowned, his confident smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What the hell are you talking about?" he scoffed, crossing his arms as if to shield himself. "That Patek Philippe on your wrist," I said, raising my hand and pointing directly at the gold timepiece. "It is a super fake. A highly sophisticated replica, but still a complete fake. I know this because my junk-buying hustle is actually luxury asset liquidation. I appraised that exact counterfeit watch for the bankrupt tech executive who quietly sold it to you last month for a fraction of its retail price to cover his gambling debts. I have the serial number and the authentication failure report sitting in my secure server right now." Bradley's face went completely rigid. The smug color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving him looking suddenly hollow and panicked. He quickly dropped his arm to his side, trying to hide the watch from view. His lawyer shot him a sharp, questioning glance, clearly unaware of his client's hidden financial desperation. "And since we are talking about your precarious finances, I know exactly why Maya was tearing my bedroom apart." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step down the stairs toward him, forcing him to look up at me. "You are vastly overleveraged. You desperately need the deed to the apartment building in Midtown to secure your new investment fund, do you not? Without those documents, your entire financial portfolio collapses, and your investors will realize you are essentially running a shell game." Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at me, realizing that the woman he had dismissed as a junk dealer held the keys to his absolute destruction. "Tell you what, Bradley," I said, my voice slicing through the cold night air. "Do not call Child Protective Services. Instead, meet me at your fancy corporate finance office this Friday at noon. I will bring the exact property documents you want so badly. But trust me, you are going to absolutely hate what is actually inside that envelope." Bradley's money moved faster than the justice system. By Saturday morning, he had posted bail, pulling his wife and his father-in-law out of their holding cells before the reality of their actions could even begin to sink in. I knew they would spend the entire weekend spinning a web of lies to protect their precious image, but I was not prepared for the stage my father would choose to launch his public counterattack. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat. For 32 years, attending First Grace Church had been a non-negotiable requirement in my family. It was the epicenter of our social world. Even after everything that had happened, I dressed Chloe in her Sunday best and drove to the morning service. I refused to cower in my own home. I refused to let my daughter think we had to hide in shame when we were the victims. I walked into that sanctuary with my head held high, guiding Chloe into our usual pew near the back. The air inside the church immediately felt thick and poisonous. First Grace was a prestigious pillar of the African American community in Atlanta. The pews were filled with doctors, lawyers, and business owners who had known me since I was a child. But today, the usual warm greetings were entirely absent. The moment I stepped through the heavy oak doors, the low hum of conversation abruptly died. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into the back of my neck. Women in their elegant Sunday hats leaned over to whisper behind their programs. The judgment was an actual physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Then my father stepped up to the pulpit. He was not wearing the wrinkled clothes of a man who had just spent the night in a jail cell. He wore a pristine, tailored suit. His silver hair perfectly brushed, his posture projecting absolute righteous authority. The congregation quieted as he gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He looked out over the sea of faces and allowed a single perfectly timed tear to roll down his cheek. He did not use my name, but he absolutely did not have to. "My heart breaks. Today, church family," he began, his voice echoing with a practiced sorrow that made my skin crawl. "We are facing a trial of the spirit in my own home. The devil is at work, trying to tear our family apart through the delusions of a prodigal daughter. A daughter who has let the greed of the secular world poison her mind so deeply that she has turned against the very blood that raised her. She has brought shame to our doorstep and invited the law into our private home over paranoid delusions." A murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the congregation. Several older women nodded, murmuring soft prayers for my father's strength. I sat frozen in my seat, listening to the man who had violently broken down my front door and terrorized my sick child now play the ultimate victim in front of hundreds of people. He was using the sanctuary of God to gaslight an entire community. I felt the overwhelming, crushing weight of cultural expectation pressing down on me from every corner of that room. Growing up as a Black woman in this specific environment, I was conditioned to follow an unspoken but unbreakable rule. We are supposed to protect the family image at all costs. We are supposed to suffer in silence to keep the peace. We are expected to pray away the abuse to shield the men in our families from the consequences of their actions and to sacrifice our own mental health on the altar of family loyalty. My father was banking on that exact cultural conditioning. He was betting his entire reputation on the assumption that I would sit there, shrink into myself, and absorb his public humiliation just to avoid causing a scene in the house of the Lord. He looked directly at me from across the massive room, his eyes cold and victorious behind his pious mask. "We must pray for those who disrespect their elders," he projected, his voice rising to a crescendo. "We must pray for the daughters who mistake their temporary worldly success for wisdom and bring the police to their own father's door. We must pray that her mind is healed before she destroys her own child's life." I looked down at Chloe. She was shifting uncomfortably in her seat, clutching my hand tightly. Her small body was tense. She looked up at the man booming on the microphone, and I saw the raw fear flash in her innocent eyes. She recognized that voice. It was the exact same voice that had cornered her against the living room sofa just days ago. In that fraction of a second, a profound and absolute clarity washed over me. If I sat here and took this, I was teaching my daughter that this behavior was acceptable. I was showing her that women must swallow abuse if it comes packaged in a nice suit and a position of authority. I was passing down the exact same generational trauma that had kept me shrinking myself for 32 years. I refused. Right in the middle of my father's dramatic, tearful plea for my soul, I stood up. The loud crack of this wooden pew resounded through the silent church like a gunshot. The organist, who had been playing a soft background melody, stumbled and stopped. The congregation collectively gasped. Every single head in the room swiveled to stare at me. My father stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open as the microphone picked up his sudden sharp intake of breath. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not yell or try to defend myself against his ridiculous sermon. I simply picked up my purse, reached down, and firmly grasped Chloe's hand. "Come on, baby," I said, my voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the dead silence. "We do not have to listen to monsters pretend to be saints." I turned my back on the pulpit. I turned my back on the gossiping aunties, the judging elders, and the toxic cultural expectations that had held me hostage my entire life. I walked slowly and deliberately down the long center aisle of the church. The silence was so profound that the only sound was the rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor. People practically shrank back into their pews as I passed them, afraid to make eye contact with a woman who had just defied the untouchable Deacon Desmond in his own territory. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the sanctuary and stepped out into the blazing midday sun. The sudden heat and the bright light felt like an absolute purification. The heavy, suffocating weight of the church vanished completely. I took a deep, cleansing breath, squeezing Chloe's hand, and offering her a genuine, reassuring smile. "You are safe," I promised her as we walked across the sprawling asphalt parking lot toward our car. "Nobody is ever going to speak to us like that again." I pulled my car keys from my purse, feeling a massive wave of victory. I had not argued. I had not played their game. I had simply removed their power over me. But as I approached my vehicle, the sharp, aggressive clack of high heels hitting the pavement echoed behind me. I stopped and turned around. Maya was storming across the parking lot, blocking the direct path to my car door. She had slipped out a side exit to intercept me. Her designer church dress was immaculate, but her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. I quickly clicked the unlock button on my key fob and ushered Chloe into the back seat of my SUV. I gently closed her door, hearing the automatic locks engage before turning to face my sister. Maya stopped mere inches from me. The Sunday service facade was entirely gone. The sweet, smiling deacon's daughter, who had just been sitting piously in the front pew, was replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. I looked right over her shoulder, observing the rest of the congregation, slowly filing out of the church doors in the distance, completely oblivious to the vicious shakedown happening at the edge of the parking lot. "Give it to me," Maya hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "Do not play stupid with me. I want the deed to apartment building number 4. I want it right now." I stared at her, keeping my posture relaxed, but guarded. So that was what this was all about. It was not about family hierarchy or maintaining their pristine image. It was about survival. Bradley's survival. Apartment building number 4 was a highly lucrative midtown property that I had legally acquired through my liquidation firm during a massive corporate bankruptcy auction 6 months ago. It was a gold mine generating massive monthly revenue. My family had scoffed when I bought it, calling it a foolish investment. Now my sister was practically frothing at the mouth to get her hands on it. You and your husband broke into my house, terrified my daughter, and destroyed my property over a real estate deed, I asked, my tone reflecting nothing but absolute disgust. You are more pathetic than I thought. Do not lecture me, you ungrateful brat, Maya snapped, taking a step closer. Bradley's investment fund is hemorrhaging money. He made some highly leveraged trades that went south, and his primary investors are demanding their quarterly returns. If he does not show them tangible collateral by Wednesday morning, they are going to trigger an audit. We need the deed to that apartment building to secure a bridge loan. We need to mortgage it to save the fund. I let her words sink in. The great Bradley, the untouchable financial genius, was drowning in debt and desperate enough to commit a home invasion to steal property from his own sister-in-law. They wanted to take the asset I had secured for my daughter's future and drain its equity to cover his catastrophic gambling on the stock market. You have absolutely no right to hold an asset like that? Maya sneered, her eyes raking over me with pure, unadulterated contempt. Look at you, Nia. You are nothing but a college dropout. You quit school, you run a dirty little warehouse operation, and you think you can play in the big leagues. You do not belong in our world. That property belongs in the hands of the elite. It belongs with people who actually have the degrees, the pedigree, and the social standing to manage it properly. Hand it over to us. Hand it over to the people who actually know how wealth works. Her elitist tirade washed over me without leaving a single mark. Years ago, her vicious words would have cut me to the bone. I would have felt the deep, stinging shame of leaving university early to focus on surviving and raising my daughter. My family had always wielded my lack of a prestigious diploma like a weapon against me, constantly reminding me that I was the uneducated failure of the family. They worshipped at the altar of Ivy League degrees and country club memberships, entirely blind to the fact that street smarts and relentless grit had built my multi-million-dollar liquidation firm. I looked at Maya, taking in her trembling hands and the frantic, desperate gleam in her eyes. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. The highly educated elite sister was standing in a church parking lot, begging the college dropout to save her from total financial ruin. You are absolutely right, Maya, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I do not have a fancy degree. I do not attend your country club galas. But I do know how to read a balance sheet, and I know a sinking ship when I see one. You and Bradley are drowning in your own greed. I am not handing over my hard-earned assets so your husband can burn them in a desperate attempt to hide his incompetence. The deed to apartment building number 4 stays exactly where it is, in my secure vault, entirely out of your reach. Maya did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum. Instead, a slow, deeply malicious smile stretched across her face. The panic in her eyes was suddenly replaced by a cold, calculated cruelty. She took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest, and looked at me with the absolute certainty of a predator who had just trapped its prey. We knew you would be stubborn, Nia, she said, her voice returning to its normal conversational volume. Bradley told me you would try to play the tough, independent businesswoman. He told me you would refuse to cooperate. But you see, my husband does not just sit around waiting for you to realize your place. He is a very powerful man in the financial sector. He has friends in very high places. Friends who sit on the executive boards of the major banks in this city. A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I kept my face blank, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing my concern, but my mind was already racing through the implications of her words. You think you are so smart with your little liquidation business? Maya taunted, leaning in close. But you cannot run a business without cash flow. Bradley made a few phone calls yesterday afternoon, right after he bailed us out of jail. He called in some major favors. As of this morning, every single business bank account associated with your firm has been completely frozen. Your operational funds, your payroll accounts, your escrow holds, everything is locked down under the guise of a pending fraud investigation. I stared at her, processing the sheer magnitude of their vindictiveness. They had weaponized the banking system against me. You have no access to your money. Nia. Maya continued, her voice dripping with triumphant poison. You cannot pay your employees. You cannot secure new assets. You cannot even buy groceries for your daughter. We have cut off your oxygen. So go ahead and hold on to that deed. Hold on to it while your business collapses and your life falls apart. You will come crawling to us by tomorrow morning begging us to take the property off your hands in exchange for lifting the freeze. You cannot win this, Nia. We are the house and the house always wins. I watched Maya standing there in the blistering heat of the church parking lot, her chest heaving with the thrill of her perceived victory. She looked so incredibly proud of herself. In her mind, she had just delivered the ultimate killing blow. She genuinely believed that her husband's ruthless corporate connections had successfully severed my financial lifeline, leaving me gasping for air. She expected me to drop to my knees on the hot asphalt, to beg for her mercy, and hand over the deed to the multi-million-dollar property she felt entitled to. Instead, I felt a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. I turned my back on her for a moment, opening the heavy door of my SUV and gently helping Chloe into her car seat. I made sure the air conditioning was running and handed my daughter her favorite tablet before securely closing the door. I took a deep breath of the thick, humid Atlanta air and slowly turned back around to face my sister. I began to walk in a slow, measured circle around her, taking in the sheer arrogance radiating from her posture. The power dynamic in the space shifted instantly. Maya's triumphant smirk began to falter as she realized I was not exhibiting a single ounce of the panic she had anticipated. "You really think you are the house, Maya?" I asked, my voice dropping to a calm, conversational tone that seemed to unnerve her even more. "You and Bradley are so blinded by your own elitism that you never bothered to actually understand what it is I do for a living. You think because I do not have a fancy Ivy League degree hanging on my wall that I am stupid. You think because I did not marry into old money that I do not understand how the financial system works?" Maya crossed her arms defensively, gripping her designer purse like a shield. "We froze your accounts, Nia," she insisted, her voice pitching up slightly. "You have nothing." "Let me explain something to you about the business of liquidating high-value assets," I said, stopping directly in front of her. "When you deal with bankrupt millionaires, corrupt executives, and desperate people who are about to lose everything, you learn exactly how they hide their wealth. You learn how they use shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex legal structures to protect their money from creditors. 5 years ago, when my firm started generating serious revenue, I knew exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. And more importantly, I knew exactly what kind of family I came from." I watched the confusion ripple across Maya's perfectly made-up face. I knew that one day my success would become a target. I continued holding her gaze. So I did not leave my assets sitting in a vulnerable generic business account under my own name. For the past 5 years, every single property I have acquired, every piece of inventory I have liquidated, and every dollar of profit I have earned has been systematically transferred into a web of independent, anonymous LLCs. My money is distributed across dozens of secure corporate entities that neither you nor Bradley nor any of his corrupt banking friends could ever trace back to me. Maya blinked, her confidence rapidly evaporating. "That is impossible," she stammered. "Bradley told me he gave the bank executive your company name. He gave them the exact routing numbers for Wilson Family Holdings. He confirmed the accounts were locked down this morning." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed across the empty parking lot. "Oh, he locked down Wilson Family Holdings, all right," I said, stepping closer so she could hear every single syllable clearly. "But I dissolved my connection to that obsolete family account 3 years ago. I only kept the shell active for one very specific reason. Do you remember when Dad got audited by the IRS last year, Maya? Do you remember how he was desperately trying to hide his questionable church donations and off-the-books income?" Maya's eyes widened in sudden dawning horror. "I let Dad use the old Wilson Family Holdings account to structure his IRS repayment plan," I explained, watching the color drain entirely from her face. "It is the sole account holding the massive lump sum he owes the federal government to keep himself out of federal prison. That is the account your brilliant husband just aggressively froze. Bradley did not cut off my oxygen, Maya. He just locked down Dad's tax money right before his quarterly payment is due. Bradley just triggered a massive federal default for our father. Maya physically stumbled backward, her designer heels scraping against the asphalt. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, unable to formulate a response. She knew exactly what Desmond would do when he found out that his golden son-in-law had accidentally triggered a federal tax investigation into his personal finances. The untouchable facade of their elite marriage was about to be burned to the ground by their own arrogant mistake. Before she could even attempt to speak, my cell phone began to ring from inside my purse. The sharp trill of the ringtone sliced through the heavy silence of the parking lot. I maintained eye contact with my sister as I slowly reached into my bag and pulled out the phone. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was Elias, my lead corporate attorney and the architect of my LLC network. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. "Go ahead, Elias," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Maya's terrified face. "Nia, we got them," Elias said, his voice crackling with professional excitement over the speaker. They fell for the trap completely. Bradley was so desperate for collateral to show his investors that he bypassed standard due diligence. He just signed a massive high-interest mortgage loan to secure emergency capital for his failing fund. "And the collateral?" I asked, a slow smile spreading across my face. "He used the forged property deeds they stole from your house," Elias confirmed. "He just pledged your father's primary estate and the church's community center as the primary collateral for a commercial bridge loan. Bradley has officially committed massive corporate wire fraud using Desmond's properties." I lowered the phone, letting the sheer magnitude of their destruction settle over the parking lot. Maya was shaking, her perfect world shattering around her. She had come here to demand my submission, and instead she was watching her husband dig his own grave. I slipped the phone back into my purse and turned toward my car. "Tell Bradley he does not need to worry about calling Child Protective Services," I said over my shoulder. "He is going to be way too busy dealing with the FBI." I left Maya standing in the suffocating heat of the church parking lot, her mouth hanging open as the reality of my words paralyzed her. I got into my SUV and drove away, watching her shrink in my rearview mirror. But I knew people like my sister and her husband. A momentary panic would not stop them. Bradley's ego was too massive to simply surrender. He would convince Maya and my father that my threats were empty bluffs from an uneducated amateur. He would tell them he had the situation entirely under control. I needed to finish this. I needed to walk right into the center of their delusional kingdom and burn it to the foundation. As soon as I got Chloe safely settled at home with her nanny, I called Elias back and told him to schedule a meeting at Bradley's corporate headquarters for Monday morning. I told him to make sure my father was there too. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. Bradley's investment firm occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of Buckhead. The entire space was meticulously designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its doors. The reception area was an expansive stretch of imported Italian marble and brushed steel. A receptionist with a sleek headset and a practiced, condescending smile directed me toward the executive suites without even asking my name. They were expecting me. I walked down the hushed, heavily carpeted hallway, my heels sinking into the expensive flooring. This was the world that had constantly rejected me, the world of old money, elite networking, and prestigious pedigrees. My family had always used this world to make me feel small. I felt absolutely no fear walking into it now. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of Bradley's private conference room. The staging was impeccably deliberate. Bradley sat at the head of a massive granite conference table, the sprawling Atlanta skyline stretching out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows like his own personal kingdom. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating supreme, unbothered arrogance. My father sat to his right, exuding the righteous authority of a patriarch who had come to oversee the discipline of a wayward child. Maya sat on his left, sipping sparkling water with a smug, serene expression. She had clearly bought whatever soothing lie Bradley had sold her over the weekend to completely erase her panic in the parking lot. None of them stood when I entered. They simply watched me with a collective gaze of profound pity and superiority. "Take a seat," Nia Bradley commanded, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He gestured casually to the single leather chair positioned at the opposite end of the long granite table. It was a classic power play, forcing me to sit as far away from them as possible, isolating me in their territory. I walked forward, but I did not sit. I remained standing, resting my hands lightly on the back of the leather chair. "I prefer to stand," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "What do we have to discuss, Bradley?" Bradley sighed, running a hand over his perfectly styled hair as if he were dealing with a particularly slow toddler. "We are here to fix the massive mess you have made of your life, Nia. Maya came home yesterday in tears, repeating some absurd nonsense you spouted in the parking lot about the FBI and my bridge loan. I have to admit, I was almost impressed by your imagination. But imagination does not pay the bills, does it?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the granite. "I know you think you pulled a fast one with those hidden LLCs. You thought you could hide your assets and play games with my banking partners. But you fundamentally misunderstand how power works in this city. You do not have the pedigree or the connections to outmaneuver a major financial institution. My partners and I have successfully frozen every single route of capital you possess. We located your shell companies by Sunday evening. You are entirely locked out. You cannot make payroll, you cannot pay your vendors, and you certainly cannot run that dirty little warehouse of yours without liquidity." I looked at my father. He was nodding slowly, his expression a mask of manufactured disappointment. "Your brother-in-law is trying to save you from yourself, Nia," Desmond said, his voice carrying that familiar booming resonance from the pulpit. "You have been walking a very dark path. You let your pride and your greed blind you to the importance of family loyalty. You disrespected me in the house of the Lord, and you threatened the very foundation of our family's good name. But the Lord teaches us forgiveness. Bradley is willing to offer you a way out of the corner you have backed yourself into." "A way out?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "How incredibly generous of him." Maya scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, stop acting so tough, Nia. You are bankrupt. We know it and you know it. Bradley is literally offering you a lifeline because Dad begged him to show mercy. Just be quiet and listen for once in your life." Bradley smiled, a thin, predatory stretching of his lips. He reached into a leather portfolio on the table and withdrew 2 thick stacks of paper. He slid them across the smooth granite surface until they stopped directly in front of me. He placed a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen perfectly parallel to the documents. "We are going to make this very simple," Bradley explained, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "The first document is a comprehensive waiver of liability. It legally retracts any and all criminal complaints you filed regarding the incident at your house last week. It states clearly that the event was a simple familial misunderstanding and completely absolves Maya, your father, and myself of any civil or criminal wrongdoing." "And the second document?" I asked, looking down at the crisp white pages. "The second document is the transfer deed for apartment building number 4. Bradley said, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "You are going to sign over the controlling interest of that property to my investment fund. In exchange, I will personally contact my banking associates and have the freeze on your operational accounts lifted immediately. I will also provide you with a modest cash injection to cover your payroll for the week, since I know you are desperate." My father leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "It is the only sensible move, Nia. You do not have the education or the capacity to manage a midtown real estate asset of that magnitude. It belongs in a professional portfolio. Sign the papers, drop this ridiculous feud, and you can go back to running your liquidation business in peace. We will not bother you again." Maya smiled, taking another sip of her water. "Just sign it, Nia. Go back to your little life and leave the real business to the adults." I stared down at the documents. The arrogance radiating from the 3 of them was so thick it was almost a physical weight in the room. They had entirely convinced themselves of their own supremacy. They genuinely believed that because I did not walk their halls or speak their corporate language, I was defenseless against their tactics. They thought they had backed a terrified, uneducated girl into a corner and were about to strip her of her most valuable asset. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold Montblanc pen. Bradley's smile widened. My father gave a satisfied nod. Maya let out a soft breath of victory. They thought they had won. They thought I was surrendering. I rolled the expensive pen between my fingers, feeling its cold weight. I looked up, meeting Bradley's eyes, then Maya's, then my father's. I let a slow, subtle smile curve the edges of my mouth. The triumphant energy in the room suddenly faltered. The air grew perfectly still. I did not lower the pen to the paper. Instead, I let it slip from my fingers. The heavy gold pen clattered loudly against the granite table, rolling away from the documents, and off the edge, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. "I do not think I will be signing anything today," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. Bradley's face hardened, his patience instantly evaporating. "Do not play games with me, Naya. I am not bluffing. Your accounts are frozen. You are financially dead in the water. Sign the damn papers." "You are right about one thing, Bradley," I said, keeping my eyes locked on his. "I do not have a fancy degree. I do not belong to your country clubs. But I do know how to read a room, and I know how to read a desperate man. You think you froze my operational accounts. You think you found my shell companies. But you did not find anything I did not want you to find." I unclasped the latch on my leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out a massive, thick stack of bound legal folders prominently displaying the sleek silver logo of my liquidation firm. I dropped the heavy stack directly on top of his extortion documents. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the pristine conference room. Bradley jumped slightly, his shoulders flinching as the heavy binders slammed against his polished granite table. He stared down at the sleek silver logo of my liquidation firm embossed on the covers. "What is this trash?" he demanded, though his voice noticeably lacked its previous venom. He was trying to maintain his mask of authority, but a microscopic crack of doubt had already appeared in his eyes. "This," I said, tapping the thick stack of paper with my index finger, "is your actual net worth, Bradley. Calculated down to the very last fraudulent penny." Maya scoffed loudly, looking at our father for solidarity. "She has completely lost her mind," she declared, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Dad, tell her to leave before Bradley calls security. She is just trying to cause a scene because she knows she is bankrupt." "I run a liquidation firm, Maya," I said, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls of the opulent office. "Do you have any idea what that actually entails?" "I do not just move dusty boxes around in a warehouse. I dissect the financial lives of bankrupt millionaires. I track hidden offshore assets. I audit complex shell companies. I expose the exact kind of white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the federal government and their investors. My entire career is built on digging up the truth that men like your husband desperately try to bury." I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the top folder. The crisp sound of the thick paper turning was the only noise in the room. I slid a certified forensic accounting report across the smooth stone surface until it stopped directly over Bradley's extortion documents. "I have spent the last 72 hours having my team tear apart Bradley's entire investment fund." I continued maintaining absolute eye contact with my brother-in-law. "I did not even have to look that hard. The arrogance of your operation was staggering. You are not a financial genius, Bradley. You are not a Wall Street prodigy revolutionizing the market. You are running a textbook Ponzi scheme." Maya let out a harsh, brittle laugh that sounded more like a bark. "A Ponzi scheme. You are pathetic, Nia. You are so violently jealous of our wealth that you are literally inventing federal crimes to make yourself feel better about being a college dropout." "Look at the balance sheets, Maya," I urged, pointing sharply at the documents spread before them. "Read the numbers. Bradley's fund went entirely bankrupt 3 years ago. He made a series of catastrophic, heavily leveraged shorts on the tech sector and completely wiped out his primary operating capital. He lost everything. He has not generated a single legitimate dollar of actual market profit since that day." Bradley's face had gone completely gray. The arrogant sneer that usually rested on his lips was entirely gone, replaced by a stark, visceral panic. He reached out to grab the folder to pull the evidence away from his wife and father-in-law, but I slapped my hand down hard on the cover, pinning it to the table. He has been using the fresh deposits of new investors to pay the quarterly dividends of his old investors. I explained, my voice cold and relentless. I turned my gaze to my father, who was now staring at Bradley with mounting horror. He has been shifting phantom money around to create the illusion of massive returns. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul just to keep up appearances. And right now the music has stopped. The original primary investors want their principal back, and the accounts are entirely empty. There is no money left. You are lying, Maya said, her voice trembling. The absolute certainty in her eyes was beginning to fracture. She turned to her husband, waiting for him to yell at me to throw me out of the office to decisively prove me wrong. Bradley said absolutely nothing. He just sat there staring at the open folder, completely trapped by the undeniable paper trail of his own destruction. We are multimillionaires, Maya insisted, her voice pitching higher as panic began to set in. We live in a luxury penthouse in Buckhead. Bradley drives a McLaren. I am wearing a $50,000 watch. You are just a bitter, uneducated failure trying to drag us down to your miserable level because you cannot handle our success. I opened the second folder. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. This was the complete and utter dismantling of the elite facade that my family had weaponized against me my entire life. I wanted Maya to feel the exact shame and humiliation she had tried to force onto me in that church parking lot. Your life is a mirage. Maya, I said, sliding a thick stack of lease agreements, default notices and appraisal certificates across the table. You live in a fantasy world funded by stolen money. Let us start with the cars. The McLaren and the Range Rover are not owned. They are leased through a high-risk auto broker specializing in subprime luxury rentals. Bradley is 4 months behind on the payments. The repossession orders were officially filed on Friday afternoon. Those cars belong to the bank, and they are coming to collect them. Maya's breath hitched audibly. She looked down at the papers, her perfectly manicured hands shaking uncontrollably as she recognized the official bank letterheads and Bradley's desperate signatures. Your beautiful penthouse? I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy. It is leased under a shell company called Apex Holdings. A shell company that currently has exactly $400 left in its operating account. The landlord has already initiated formal eviction proceedings due to non-payment. You do not own a single brick of that property, Maya. You are high-end squatters. Bradley, Maya whispered, turning fully toward her husband. Tell her she is lying. Tell her to get out of your office right now. Tell her it is a lie. Bradley just swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat tracing a slow line down his pale forehead. He could not look at her. He could not look at anyone. The untouchable golden boy was sitting motionless in the absolute ruins of his own making. I was not finished. I reached across the table and pointed directly at Maya's trembling wrist. And that watch you love to flaunt at Sunday service, I said, making sure my father heard every word. The Patek Philippe you make sure everyone in the congregation sees when you pass the collection plate. I had my lead jewelry appraiser pull the serial number from the insurance registry Bradley submitted last year. It is a fake Maya. It is a very high-quality replica manufactured in a factory in Shenzhen. It is worth maybe $500 on the black market. You are wearing cheap costume jewelry. The room seemed to tilt violently. I watched Maya's entire worldview shatter in real time. The psychological blow of the revelation was devastating to witness. She was a woman who had built her entire identity and self-worth on her perceived social superiority, on the designer brands she wore, and the exclusive zip code she lived in. Discovering that her elite, untouchable status was nothing but a cheap counterfeit production broke her completely. She shrank back into her expensive leather chair, clutching her chest as if she could physically hold the fracturing pieces of her reality together. Her eyes darted wildly around the opulent office, suddenly realizing that everything she saw was a lie. The gleaming glass walls, the heavy granite table, the sweeping views of the city, none of it belonged to them. They were imposters playing dress-up with stolen funds. You married a fraud, Maya, I said, my words cutting through the heavy silence. You spent years looking down your nose at me, treating me like dirt because I worked for a living and did not have a degree. You worshipped Bradley because he gave you the illusion of power and prestige. But you are poorer than the people you look down on. You have absolutely nothing. You are worse than broke. You are deeply in debt to very dangerous people. My father had been sitting in frozen silence, his large hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The righteous fury of the church deacon had been entirely erased. In its place was a raw, visceral terror. He looked from the forensic accounting reports to the eviction notices and finally to Bradley's sweating, terrified face. The truth finally penetrated his stubborn, elitist mind. The golden son-in-law he had paraded around the community was a criminal. Impossible! Desmond gasped, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a ragged, desperate wheeze. He pushed himself up from the table, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. This is impossible. I turned to him, watching the realization dawn on the man who had always demanded perfection and blind obedience. It is the truth, Dad, I said calmly. You tied your pristine reputation and your family's good name to a con artist. Desmond's chest heaved rapidly as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Bradley. Impossible, he repeated, his voice rising in sheer panic. Bradley just borrowed $300,000 from me in cash for a new municipal bond fund. He swore the returns were guaranteed. He used my own house as collateral. I did not break eye contact with Bradley as the heavy folders settled on the granite. I simply tapped the top cover with one finger. Go ahead, Bradley, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Open it. Show my father and your wife exactly what kind of financial genius you really are. Bradley did not move. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. He stared at the silver logo of my firm as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Maya scoffed loudly, looking at our father for solidarity. She has completely lost her mind, she declared, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. Dad, tell her to leave before Bradley calls security. She is just trying to cause a scene because she knows she is bankrupt. I run a liquidation firm, Maya, I said, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls of the opulent office. Do you have any idea what that actually entails? I do not just move dusty boxes around in a warehouse. I dissect the financial lives of bankrupt millionaires. I track hidden offshore assets. I audit complex shell companies. I expose the exact kind of white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the federal government and their investors. My entire career is built on digging up the truth that men like your husband desperately try to bury. I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the top folder. The crisp sound of the thick paper turning was the only noise in the room. I slid a certified forensic accounting report across the smooth stone surface until it stopped directly in front of Maya. I have spent the last 72 hours having my team tear apart Bradley's entire investment fund. I continued, maintaining absolute eye contact with my brother-in-law. I did not even have to look that hard. The arrogance of your operation was staggering. You are not a financial genius, Bradley. You are not a Wall Street prodigy revolutionizing the market. You are running a textbook Ponzi scheme. Maya let out a harsh, brittle laugh that sounded more like a bark. A Ponzi scheme. You are pathetic, Nia. You are so violently jealous of our wealth that you are literally inventing federal crimes to make yourself feel better about being a college dropout. Look at the balance sheets, Maya, I urged, pointing sharply at the documents spread before her. Read the numbers. Bradley's fund went entirely bankrupt 3 years ago. He made a series of catastrophic, heavily leveraged shorts on the tech sector and completely wiped out his primary operating capital. He lost everything. He has not generated a single legitimate dollar of actual market profit since that day. Bradley's hands began to shake. He reached out to grab the folder to pull the evidence away from his wife, but I slapped my hand down hard on the cover, pinning it to the table. He has been using the fresh deposits of new investors to pay the quarterly dividends of his old investors. I explained, my voice cold and relentless. I turned my gaze to my father, who was now staring at Bradley with mounting horror. He has been shifting phantom money around to create the illusion of massive returns. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul just to keep up appearances, and right now the music has stopped. The original primary investors want their principal back, and the accounts are entirely empty. There is no money left. You are lying, Maya said, her voice trembling. The absolute certainty in her eyes was beginning to fracture. She turned to her husband, waiting for him to yell at me to throw me out of the office, to decisively prove me wrong. Bradley said absolutely nothing. He just sat there staring at the open folder, completely trapped by the undeniable paper trail of his own destruction. We are multimillionaires, Maya insisted, her voice pitching higher as panic began to set in. We live in a luxury penthouse in Buckhead. Bradley drives a McLaren. I am wearing a $50,000 watch. You are just a bitter, uneducated failure trying to drag us down to your miserable level because you cannot handle our success. Your life is a mirage. Maya, I said, sliding a thick stack of lease agreements, default notices, and appraisal certificates across the table. You live in a fantasy world funded by stolen money. Let us start with the cars. The McLaren and the Range Rover are not owned. They are leased through a high-risk auto broker specializing in subprime luxury rentals. Bradley is 4 months behind on the payments. The repossession orders were officially filed on Friday afternoon. Those cars belong to the bank and they are coming to collect them. Maya's breath hitched audibly. She looked down at the papers, her perfectly manicured hands shaking uncontrollably as she recognized the official bank letterheads and Bradley's desperate signatures. Your beautiful penthouse. I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy. It is leased under a shell company called Apex Holdings, a shell company that currently has exactly $400 left in its operating account. The landlord has already initiated formal eviction proceedings due to non-payment. You do not own a single brick of that property, Maya. You are high-end squatters. Bradley, Maya whispered, turning fully toward her husband. Tell her she is lying. Tell her to get out of your office right now. Tell her it is a lie. Bradley just swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat tracing a slow line down his pale forehead. He could not look at her. He could not look at anyone. The untouchable golden boy was sitting motionless in the absolute ruins of his own making. My father had been sitting in frozen silence, his large hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The righteous fury of the church deacon had been entirely erased. In its place was a raw, visceral terror. He looked from the forensic accounting reports to the eviction notices and finally to Bradley's sweating, terrified face. The truth finally penetrated his stubborn, elitist mind. The golden son-in-law he had paraded around the community was a criminal. Impossible! Desmond gasped, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a ragged, desperate wheeze. He pushed himself up from the table, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. This is impossible. I turned to him, watching the realization dawn on the man who had always demanded perfection and blind obedience. It is the truth, Dad, I said calmly. You tied your pristine reputation and your family's good name to a con artist. Desmond's chest heaved rapidly as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Bradley. Impossible, he repeated, his voice rising in sheer panic. Bradley just borrowed $300,000 from me to invest in a new municipal bond fund. He swore the returns were guaranteed. He used my own house as collateral. The room went dead silent. My focus shifted instantly from Bradley's pale, sweating face to my father. I felt my posture straighten, a deadly calm washing over me as the pieces of their horrific puzzle finally clicked into place. You used the house, Dad? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Which house exactly? Because the only property you have left is the family estate in Oakwood. And correct me if I am wrong, but when Mom passed away, she left that house jointly to you, Maya, and me. Desmond went completely rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his tailored Sunday suit. A joint tenancy requires all parties to sign off on any major financial encumbrance. I continued, stepping away from my chair and walking slowly down the length of the conference table. I certainly never signed a mortgage agreement. I never authorized a $300,000 lien on my childhood home. Desmond looked at Maya. Maya looked at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Oh, I see. You did not just make a terrible investment, Dad. You committed felony fraud. It was temporary. Desmond stammered, the sweat now beading on his own forehead. Bradley said he just needed the capital for 30 days. The returns were guaranteed. We were going to pay off the lien before you ever found out. So, you forged my signature, I stated, making sure the words rang clearly through the room. You forged my signature on a federal bank document. And let me guess. Maya, as a registered notary for Bradley's firm, stamped the paperwork to make it look official. Maya shrank into her chair, her silence an absolute confession. You risked the only asset our mother left us to fund a Ponzi scheme, I said, the disgust rolling off me in waves. You were so desperate to maintain the illusion of wealth, so desperate to keep Bradley on his pedestal, that you committed a federal crime and risked putting your own daughter on the hook for a massive debt. Bradley suddenly slammed both his hands on the table, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. Shut up, both of you, shut up! He glared at me, his chest heaving with desperate anger. You think you have us cornered, Nia. You think you are so smart, but you cannot do a single thing about it. I stopped pacing and tilted my head. Really? Yes, really? Bradley sneered, gaining a fraction of his false confidence back. The original lender already sold that specific debt portfolio. They bundled it and sold it off to a state-level debt collection agency 2 weeks ago when my initial payments bounced. It is out of my hands. It is out of the bank's hands. That state agency is highly aggressive. They do not negotiate, and they certainly do not care about forged signatures. They are going to foreclose on your precious family home by the end of the month, and there is absolutely nothing your little liquidation business can do to stop them. Desmond buried his face in his hands, letting out a wretched sob. Maya was openly crying now, her perfect mascara running down her cheeks as the reality of prison time and homelessness stared her in the face. But I did not react with panic. I did not yell. I simply looked at Bradley and let a bright, genuine smile spread across my face. You are right, Bradley, I said, my voice smooth and utterly victorious. That debt portfolio was bundled and sold. It was purchased by a highly aggressive agency that specializes in acquiring distressed assets and high-risk liabilities. Bradley frowned, confused by my complete lack of fear. But you really should pay closer attention to the corporate filings of the agencies you deal with. I continued, reaching into my tote bag one final time. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper and slid it down the granite table. It stopped right in front of him. That state-level debt collection agency is a subsidiary of Vanguard Liquidation, and Vanguard Liquidation is my primary holding company. Bradley stopped breathing. His eyes darted down to the paper, taking in the official seal and my signature at the bottom of the acquisition document. I bought your debt, Bradley, I said, leaning over the table so I was just inches from his terrified face. I own the mortgage on my father's house. I own the bridge loan you defaulted on. I own the leases on your repossessed cars. I am your legal creditor. I own you. I left Maya standing in the suffocating heat of the church parking lot, her mouth hanging open as the reality of my words paralyzed her. I got into my SUV and drove away, watching her shrink in my rearview mirror. But I knew people like my sister and her husband. A momentary panic would not stop them. Bradley's ego was too massive to simply surrender. He would convince Maya and my father that my threats were empty bluffs from an uneducated amateur. He would tell them he had the situation entirely under control. I needed to finish this. I needed to walk right into the center of their delusional kingdom and burn it to the foundation. As soon as I got Chloe safely settled at home with her nanny, I called Elias back and told him to schedule a meeting at Bradley's corporate headquarters for Monday morning. I told him to make sure my father was there too. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. Bradley's investment firm occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of Buckhead. The entire space was meticulously designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its doors. The reception area was an expansive stretch of imported Italian marble and brushed steel. A receptionist with a sleek headset and a practiced condescending smile directed me toward the executive suites without even asking my name. They were expecting me. I walked down the hushed, heavily carpeted hallway, my heels sinking into the expensive flooring. This was the world that had constantly rejected me, the world of old money elite networking and prestigious pedigrees. My family had always used this world to make me feel small. I felt absolutely no fear walking into it now. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of Bradley's private conference room. The staging was impeccably deliberate. Bradley sat at the head of a massive granite conference table, the sprawling Atlanta skyline stretching out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, like his own personal kingdom. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating supreme, unbothered arrogance. My father sat to his right, exuding the righteous authority of a patriarch who had come to oversee the discipline of a wayward child. Maya sat on his left, sipping sparkling water with a smug, serene expression. She had clearly bought whatever soothing lie Bradley had sold her over the weekend to completely erase her panic in the parking lot. None of them stood when I entered. They simply watched me with a collective gaze of profound pity and superiority. "Take a seat," Nia Bradley commanded, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He gestured casually to the single leather chair positioned at the opposite end of the long granite table. It was a classic power play, forcing me to sit as far away from them as possible, isolating me in their territory. I walked forward, but I did not sit. I remained standing, resting my hands lightly on the back of the leather chair. "I prefer to stand," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "What do we have to discuss, Bradley?" Bradley sighed, running a hand over his perfectly styled hair, as if he were dealing with a particularly slow toddler. "We are here to fix the massive mess you have made of your life, Nia. Maya came home yesterday in tears, repeating some absurd nonsense you spouted in the parking lot about the FBI and my bridge loan. I have to admit I was almost impressed by your imagination. But imagination does not pay the bills, does it?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the granite. "I know you think you pulled a fast one with those hidden LLCs. You thought you could hide your assets and play games with my banking partners. But you fundamentally misunderstand how power works in this city. You do not have the pedigree or the connections to outmaneuver a major financial institution. My partners and I have successfully frozen every single route of capital you possess. We located your shell companies by Sunday evening. You are entirely locked out. You cannot make payroll, you cannot pay your vendors, and you certainly cannot run that dirty little warehouse of yours without liquidity." I looked at my father. He was nodding slowly, his expression a mask of manufactured disappointment. "Your brother-in-law is trying to save you from yourself, Nia," Desmond said, his voice carrying that familiar booming resonance from the pulpit. "You have been walking a very dark path. You let your pride and your greed blind you to the importance of family loyalty. You disrespected me in the house of the Lord, and you threatened the very foundation of our family's good name. But the Lord teaches us forgiveness. Bradley is willing to offer you a way out of the corner you have backed yourself into." "A way out?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. How incredibly generous of him. Maya scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, stop acting so tough, Nia. You are bankrupt. We know it and you know it. Bradley is literally offering you a lifeline because Dad begged him to show mercy. Just be quiet and listen for once in your life." Bradley smiled, a thin, predatory stretching of his lips. He reached into a leather portfolio on the table and withdrew 2 thick stacks of paper. He slid them across the smooth granite surface until they stopped directly in front of me. He placed a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen perfectly parallel to the documents. "We are going to make this very simple," Bradley explained, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "The first document is a comprehensive waiver of liability. It legally retracts any and all criminal complaints you filed regarding the incident at your house last week. It states clearly that the event was a simple familial misunderstanding and completely absolves Maya, your father, and myself of any civil or criminal wrongdoing." "And the second document?" I asked, looking down at the crisp white pages. "The second document is the transfer deed for apartment building number 4. Bradley said, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. You are going to sign over the controlling interest of that property to my investment fund. In exchange, I will personally contact my banking associates and have the freeze on your operational accounts lifted immediately. I will also provide you with a modest cash injection to cover your payroll for the week, since I know you are desperate. My father leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. It is the only sensible move, Nia. You do not have the education or the capacity to manage a midtown real estate asset of that magnitude. It belongs in a professional portfolio. Sign the papers, drop this ridiculous feud, and you can go back to running your liquidation business in peace. We will not bother you again. Maya smiled, taking another sip of her water. Just sign it, Nia. Go back to your little life and leave the real business to the adults. I stared down at the documents. The arrogance radiating from the three of them was so thick, it was almost a physical weight in the room. They had entirely convinced themselves of their own supremacy. They genuinely believed that because I did not walk their halls or speak their corporate language, I was defenseless against their tactics. They thought they had backed a terrified, uneducated girl into a corner and were about to strip her of her most valuable asset. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold Mont Blanc pen. Bradley's smile widened. My father gave a satisfied nod. Maya let out a soft breath of victory. They thought they had won. They thought I was surrendering. I rolled the expensive pen between my fingers, feeling its cold weight. I looked up, meeting Bradley's eyes, then Maya's, then my father's. I let a slow, subtle smile curve the edges of my mouth. The triumphant energy in the room suddenly faltered. The air grew perfectly still. I did not lower the pen to the paper. Instead, I let it slip from my fingers. The heavy gold pen clattered loudly against the granite table, rolling away from the documents, and off the edge, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. I do not think I will be signing anything today, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. Bradley's face hardened, his patience instantly evaporating. Do not play games with me, Nia. I am not bluffing. Your accounts are frozen. You are financially dead in the water. Sign the damn papers. You are right, Bradley, I said, keeping my eyes locked on his. I do not have a fancy degree. I do not belong to your country clubs. But I do know how to read a room, and I know how to read a desperate man. You think you froze my operational accounts. You think you found my shell companies. But you did not find anything I did not want you to find. I unclasped the latch on my leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out a massive, thick stack of bound legal folders, prominently displaying the sleek silver logo of my liquidation firm. I dropped the heavy stack directly on top of his extortion documents. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the pristine conference room. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was the kind of suffocating, heavy quiet that only occurs when a person's entire universe collapses in on itself. Bradley sat frozen in his oversized leather chair, his mouth slightly open, his chest entirely still, as if his lungs had forgotten how to draw in air. The realization that I was not just a target, but the very architect of his destruction was short-circuiting his brain. He had built his entire identity on being the smartest man in the room, the untouchable elite who could crush anyone beneath his designer shoes. Now he was staring into the eyes of the woman who held the literal deed to his financial execution. I pushed myself away from the back of my chair. I did not rush. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the side of the massive granite conference table. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the polished hardwood border of the room echoed like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of their reign. I began to walk down the length of the room, pacing myself with the agonizing slowness of a predator circling its trapped prey. My father physically recoiled as I passed behind his chair. Desmond, the great patriarch, the man who had stood at pulpits for decades preaching about morality while secretly forging his own daughter's signature, was trembling. I could smell the stale, nervous sweat seeping through his expensive cologne. He had gambled his home, his legacy, and his freedom on Bradley's polished facade. He had eagerly thrown me to the wolves to protect his own greed. And now the wolves were at his door, and they were wearing my face. I continued my measured walk around the table until I reached Maya. My sister was entirely paralyzed. Her perfectly manicured hands were gripping the edge of the granite so tightly that her knuckles were bone white. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. She looked like a porcelain doll that was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces. For our entire lives, Maya had operated under the delusion that she was fundamentally superior to me. She believed her beauty, her marriage to a white corporate elite, and her proximity to old money made her untouchable. She had sneered at my liquidation business, calling it dirty and low class. She had demanded my submission. I stopped right beside her chair. I stood close enough to see the microscopic tremors racking her shoulders. I looked down at her, taking in the sheer terror radiating from her wide, perfectly lined eyes. I reached into the leather portfolio I carried and withdrew a single crisp piece of heavy legal paper. It was distinct from the financial audits and the bank ledgers. It had a bright red seal stamped prominently at the top right corner. I held it between two fingers, letting it hover directly in her line of sight for a long, agonizing moment before I let it drop. It landed with a soft slap right on top of her folded hands. "Read it, Maya," I commanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "Read the document your husband has been hiding from you for months." Maya squeezed her eyes shut violently, shaking her head from side to side. She did not want to look. She knew that whatever was printed on that page would permanently obliterate the fantasy life she was clinging to. "Read it," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip through the quiet room. She flinched, her eyes snapping open. Her trembling gaze lowered to the paper. I watched her read the bold block letters printed at the top of the page. "Official notice of eviction and seizure of property." "You wanted the deed to apartment building number 4, Maya?" I asked, leaning down so my face was only inches from hers. "You and Bradley called me here today to extort that specific property from me. You demanded I hand it over to save my little business. Do you know why I found that so incredibly amusing?" Maya could not speak. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She just stared at the eviction notice as if it were written in a foreign language. "Because apartment building number 4 is not just a standalone midtown property," I explained, keeping my tone deadly and conversational. "It is the flagship asset of a subsidiary real estate portfolio owned by my holding company. And do you know what other property falls under that exact same portfolio, Maya? Your luxury penthouse." Maya's head snapped up, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. "No!" She whispered the word, barely escaping her throat. "That is impossible. Bradley said he bought the penthouse. He said it was in a trust." "Bradley says a lot of things," I replied, standing up straight and looking down at her with absolute disgust. "But the truth is, you live in a leased unit owned by a corporate entity that I acquired 2 years ago. I am your landlord, Maya. And according to my accounting department, you and your elite, highly educated husband have owed me 8 months of back rent. You have been living in my property, sleeping under my roof, and masquerading as royalty on my dime." Maya let out a choked, desperate sob, turning wildly toward Bradley. "Bradley, tell her she is lying. Tell me we own our home. Please tell me we own the penthouse." Bradley did not look at her. He remained slumped in his chair at the head of the table, staring blankly at the wall. The fight had completely drained out of him. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man who had finally run out of lies to tell. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. "You owe me over $120,000 in unpaid rent and late fees." I continued, refusing to give her a single second to breathe. "My legal team filed the final notices 30 days ago. The grace period expired on Friday. So let me explain exactly what is going to happen on Monday morning, Maya. The police chief will come to seal off her penthouse on Monday morning." Maya physically recoiled, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if she had been stabbed. "The Fulton County Sheriff's Department will arrive at your building at exactly 8 in the morning. I detailed, ensuring every word painted a vivid, terrifying picture in her mind. "They will bypass the doorman and take the private elevator directly to your floor. They will knock on your custom oak door, and they will give you exactly 15 minutes to gather whatever personal items you can carry in your hands." You will not be allowed to pack your designer clothes. You will not be allowed to take the imported furniture. Every single item inside that penthouse will be legally seized as collateral against the massive debt you owe my company. No, Maya wailed, the sound tearing from her throat in a high-pitched shriek. You cannot do this. I am your sister. You cannot put me on the street. My friends will see. The entire building will see. They will see you for exactly what you are. I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. A fraud. A parasite who built her entire personality on looking down at the very person who secretly owned the roof over her head. They are going to escort you through the lobby in front of your wealthy neighbors, in front of the concierge you tip with stolen money, and they are going to put a heavy steel padlock on your front door. You are going to stand on the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on your back. Desmond slammed his hand against the table, trying desperately to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely out of his grasp. Nia. This is enough, he roared, his face purple with rage and terror. You will stop this immediately. You will call off this eviction. I am your father, and I am ordering you to stop this madness. You are destroying your sister's life out of pure vindictiveness. I turned slowly to face my father. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. He was sitting there, a man who had just forged my signature to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars, attempting to invoke parental authority. You do not get to order me to do anything, Desmond, I said, taking a step toward him. You lost the right to call yourself my father the moment you decided my financial security was acceptable collateral for your Golden Boys Ponzi scheme. You sat in this room and tried to help them steal my property to cover up your own federal crimes. I did it for the family, Desmond stammered, retreating slightly as I approached. I was trying to secure our future. Bradley promised me. Bradley is a con artist, I shouted, my voice finally rising to match the intensity of the betrayal. And you were greedy enough to fall for it. You committed wire fraud. You forged signatures on banking documents. Do you understand that I am the only thing standing between you and a federal indictment right now? I hold the paper that proves you committed a felony. If I hand this folder over to the FBI, you will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary. You will lose the church. You will lose your congregation. And you will lose every ounce of the holy, righteous reputation you care so much about. Desmond's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The threat of public exposure, of losing his congregation and his status in the community, was the only thing that could truly break him. He sank back into his chair, looking like a deflated, fragile old man. Maya was weeping hysterically now, her face buried in her hands. The pristine, unbothered elite woman who had mocked me in the church parking lot was gone, entirely erased by the crushing weight of reality. I looked around the room, taking in the utter devastation I had orchestrated. They had brought me here to force me to my knees, to strip me of my dignity and my hard-earned business. They had fully expected me to surrender. Instead, I had dismantled their entire universe. I walked back to my side of the table, calmly picking up my empty leather tote bag. I looked at Bradley, who was still staring vacantly into space. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before the sheriff arrives. Bradley, I said, my tone brisk and professional, I suggest you spend that time figuring out how you are going to explain to your investors that their money is gone. Because once the eviction goes public, the SEC will be right behind them. I turned my back on the three of them, leaving the forensic reports, the eviction notice, and the proof of their absolute destruction resting on the polished granite table. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, the sound of my heels ringing out loud and clear against the hardwood floor. I did not look back as I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the bright sunlit hallway, leaving them trapped in the ruins of their own arrogance. Would you like to explore what happens when the FBI inevitably gets involved with Bradley's operations? The words hung in the sterile air of the boardroom like an executioner's blade. The absolute silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. I stood tall at the edge of the granite table, watching the exact moment the polished, untouchable facade of my father shattered completely. Desmond, the great patriarch, the man who had stood at pulpits for decades, preaching about morality and righteous authority, suddenly lost all control of his body. His knees simply gave out. He collapsed, hitting the expensive hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The pristine tailoring of his charcoal suit crumpled around him as he fell. "Dad," Maya shrieked, her voice cracking in pure terror. She lunged forward in her chair but remained paralyzed, unable to actually reach out to him. Watching the man she believed to be a god fall to the floor broke whatever fragile thread of sanity she had left. My father did not look at her. He did not look at Bradley, who was still staring blankly at the wall like a dead man. Desmond looked only at me. He scrambled forward on his knees, the fabric of his expensive trousers sliding awkwardly across the polished wood. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the edge of the leather chair I had been standing next to. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a ragged, wet sob. Tears began to stream down his wrinkled face, ruining his dignified image. "You cannot do this. You have to stop this right now. I am a church elder, Nia. I have spent 30 years building my congregation, building respect in this community. I cannot lose my home. I cannot lose everything." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, just a cold, sharp clarity that had been missing for my entire life. "You should have thought about your congregation before you committed federal wire fraud, Desmond," I said, my voice perfectly level. He shook his head violently, his tears dripping onto the expensive carpet. "It was a mistake. It was a moment of weakness. Bradley promised me the money was safe. He swore it was a guaranteed return. I was only trying to protect our family's legacy." "Nia, please, you have to show mercy. Blood is thicker than water. We are family. You cannot do this to your own family. I am your father. I am begging you to forgive me." "Family." I repeated the word, tasting like ash on my tongue. I stepped away from the chair, forcing him to look up at me from the floor. "When you stood in my driveway last week and watched my daughter scream in pure fear because your golden son-in-law brought thugs to my door to steal my property, did you remember she was your blood? When you gladly handed over my obsolete company routing numbers so Bradley could freeze my accounts and starve me out, did you remember, family?" Desmond flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but I refused to let him speak. "When you sat at this very table and forged my signature to place a $300,000 lien on the only asset our mother left us, just to feed Maya's delusions of grandeur, did you remember, family?" I demanded, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You did not come here today as a father, Desmond. You came here as an accomplice. You came here to oversee my execution. You sat in that chair smiling while Bradley tried to extort me because you thought I was weak. You thought I was stupid. You thought because I do not have a fancy degree and I work for a living that you could just crush me and take what is mine. I did not know, Nia," he wept, his hands shaking violently as he pressed them to his face. "I did not understand how bad Bradley's finances were. He lied to us. He lied to all of us." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "He did not lie to you. He just told you exactly what your ego wanted to hear. You were so blinded by your obsession with status and old money that you handed over the keys to your entire life to a con artist. And now you expect me to act like a dutiful daughter and bail you out." "Nia, I will do anything," Desmond pleaded, his voice reduced to a pathetic whine. "I will pay you back. I will give you my pension. Just transfer the debt back to the bank. Let me negotiate with them. If the church finds out I forged a signature, if they find out about the house, I am ruined. They will strip me of my title. They will excommunicate me." I looked at the man groveling on the floor. For 35 years, he had made me feel like an outsider in my own home. He had praised Maya's every mediocre achievement while dismissing my relentless hard work. He had treated my business like a dirty little secret because it involved liquidating failed assets instead of trading imaginary stocks. "The bank will not negotiate with you, Desmond," I stated coldly, "because the bank does not own your debt anymore. I do, and I am far less forgiving than any financial institution in this city." "Dad, get up." Maya suddenly screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. She was gripping her own hair, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "Stop begging her. Stop it. She is just a glorified junk dealer. She cannot do this to us. Bradley, tell him she cannot do this." Bradley finally moved. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife, his expression completely hollow. She can. Maya, he whispered, his voice dead. She has the paper. She owns the holding company. We have nothing. Maya let out a guttural sound of denial, shaking her head frantically. No. No, we have the accounts. We have the trust funds. Dad has his retirement. I looked at Maya, then back down at my father, who was still weeping on the floor. I decided it was time to drop the final piece of reality onto their shattered world. Your retirement is gone, Dad, I said quietly. Desmond froze, his tears stopping instantly as a new wave of terror washed over him. He stared up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. What are you talking about? I pulled the last document from my tote bag. It was not a forensic report or a deed. It was a simple printout of an email chain from my attorney, Elias. Do you remember what I told Maya in the church parking lot? I asked, looking directly into Desmond's eyes. Do you remember when I explained exactly what Bradley did when he aggressively froze the Wilson family holdings account last week? Desmond's face went completely slack. The IRS payment, he whispered, the color draining from his lips. Yes, I said, nodding slowly. The IRS payment. The massive lump sum of back taxes and penalties you owed to keep yourself out of federal prison for tax evasion. You structured that repayment plan using the old family shell account because you wanted to hide the paper trail from your church board. You put every single dollar of your liquid retirement savings into that account to make the quarterly transfer today. Desmond clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. Bradley froze that account on Friday afternoon, believing he was cutting off my operational funds, I explained, pointing a finger at the broken man sitting at the head of the table. But I removed my business from that shell 3 years ago. The only money sitting in that frozen account was your IRS payment. And because Bradley flagged the account under suspicion of corporate fraud, the bank automatically initiated a federal lockdown. I dropped the email printout onto the floor right in front of Desmond's knees. The IRS deadline was 9 o'clock this morning, I said, checking my watch. It is now 10:15. You defaulted on your federal tax settlement, Desmond, and because the account is frozen under suspicion of wire fraud, the IRS has already triggered an automatic audit of your entire financial history. They are going to look into every single donation, every church fund, and every off-the-books transaction you have ever made. No, Desmond wailed, dropping his forehead to the hardwood floor. Lord have mercy. No. There is no mercy left in this room, I said, turning my back on him. You built a house of cards on top of a foundation of lies, and you let this arrogant fraud set the whole thing on fire. I walked over to the stack of documents I had placed on the table earlier. I carefully collected my forensic reports, my eviction notices, and my proof of debt ownership. I tapped them neatly against the granite, slipping them safely back into my leather tote bag. Maya was rocking back and forth in her chair, staring vacantly at the expensive marble walls of the boardroom. Her perfect life was gone. Her penthouse was being seized. Her luxury cars were being repossessed. Her husband was a bankrupt criminal facing federal fraud charges. And her father, the man who was supposed to protect her and provide an endless safety net, was facing absolute ruin and potential prison time. I slung my bag over my shoulder and looked at the three of them one last time. They looked exactly like the people I dealt with every single day in my line of work. Bankrupt, desperate, and entirely stripped of their illusions. I am initiating the foreclosure on the Oakwood estate tomorrow morning, I said, directing my words to the top of my father's head. You have 30 days to clear your personal belongings out of the house before my crews arrive to change the locks and liquidate the interior. Desmond did not respond. He just lay on the floor, weeping quietly into his hands, his pristine reputation reduced to garbage. And Maya, I added, pausing near the heavy mahogany doors. I strongly suggest you start packing your things right now. The sheriff does not care about your designer shoes, and 15 minutes goes by very fast when you are being thrown out onto the street. I pushed open the boardroom doors, the heavy wood gliding silently on its hinges. I stepped out into the brightly lit corporate hallway, breathing in the cool air conditioning. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, offering her practiced, condescending smile, entirely unaware that the firm she worked for was already dead. I smiled back, a genuine expression of absolute freedom. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and left them all to burn in the fire they had started. The soft chime of the elevator arriving was entirely drowned out by the sound of the heavy mahogany boardroom doors violently smashing against the hallway walls behind me. Bradley charged out into the reception area, his face distorted into a mask of pure animalistic rage. The polished, arrogant elite executive had completely vanished. In his place was a cornered, desperate predator whose entire universe had just been forcefully ripped from his grasp. The air in the hallway seemed to tilt violently, shifting into a chaotic, dizzying blur as he closed the distance between us in 3 massive strides. "You think you can destroy me?" he roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. His custom-tailored suit jacket flapped wildly around him as he raised a fist, slamming it hard against the Italian marble wall just inches from my face. "You are nothing but a worthless, uneducated liquidator. You think you can just walk in here and take my life." He lunged forward, raising his hands to grab me by the shoulders. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, holding my ground as the elevator doors slid completely open. "Step away from her right now," a sharp, authoritative voice commanded. Bradley froze, his hands hovering inches from my collarbone. He whipped his head toward the elevator. Elias stepped out into the pristine reception area, adjusting his suit jacket with absolute professional calm. Flanking him on either side were 2 tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. Gold badges gleamed brightly from the belts clipped to their waists. The unmistakable, bold yellow letters of the FBI were printed across their credentials. The power dynamic in the room inverted so fast it was almost blinding. Bradley stumbled backward, his designer shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. His eyes darted wildly from Elias to the federal agents, and then finally back to me. The raw violence in his posture immediately evaporated, replaced by a sudden suffocating terror. "You did not really think I just came here to buy your debt and gloat? Did you, Bradley?" I asked, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational tone that sliced right through his panic. "I told you exactly what I do for a living. I am a liquidation expert. I spend my entire life tracking down hidden assets, exposing shell companies, and analyzing fraudulent financial records. When I started digging into your fund to protect my own money, I found a paper trail so wide and so incredibly arrogant that it practically audited itself." Bradley shook his head, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. "You cannot do this," he stammered, taking another step away from the agents. "That debt was sold to a state recovery firm. It is a civil matter. It is just a civil property dispute." "It was a civil matter until I bought the debt," I corrected, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Once I took ownership of your fraudulent bridge loan and the forged property deeds, I became your legal creditor. And as a legally defrauded party, I had a very simple obligation to report your activities to the authorities. I did not just send them a tip, Bradley. I handed them a meticulously compiled, fully authenticated dossier of your entire operation." The lead FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Bradley Winston," he said, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and the operation of an illegal Ponzi scheme." Maya and Desmond had stumbled out of the boardroom just in time to hear the charges. Maya let out a blood-curdling shriek, rushing forward and grabbing Bradley's arm as if her sheer willpower could stop the federal agents from taking him. "No!" she screamed, batting wildly at the agent's hands. "You cannot take him. He is a respected investment banker. We are the victims here. She is lying. My sister is lying to you because she is jealous of our wealth." The second agent stepped between Maya and her husband, gently but firmly pushing her back. "Mom, step away," he warned. "There is one more charge, Bradley," I said, watching the cold, heavy steel lock securely around his wrists. "And this is the one that is going to ensure you do not see the outside of a federal penitentiary for a very long time." Bradley looked up at me, his eyes wide and vacant. His expensive watch clinked hollowly against the handcuffs. Elder financial exploitation. I announced, pronouncing every single syllable with crystal clear precision. You knowingly manipulated a man over the age of 65 into signing over his primary residence and his life savings to fund a fraudulent investment vehicle. You preyed on a vulnerable senior citizen. Desmond, who had been standing frozen near the boardroom doors, suddenly collapsed. His knees hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The proud, booming patriarch, the man who had demanded my absolute submission and mocked my lack of a college degree, was completely broken. The realization of what that specific charge meant washed over him in real time. I had legally classified him as a victim. I had framed his involvement not as the actions of a savvy co-conspirator, but as the tragic manipulation of a foolish, vulnerable old man. It was the ultimate insult to his massive, fragile ego. It saved him from federal prison, but it utterly destroyed his pride, his reputation, and his standing as the untouchable head of the family. Desmond scrambled forward on his knees, his expensive trousers dragging across the floor. He reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the hem of my jacket. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face, completely ruining his dignified image. "Nia, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a ragged, wet sob. "I am a church elder, Nia. I am the head of this family. I cannot lose my home. I cannot lose the estate. Blood is thicker than water. Please, I am begging you. You have to forgive me. You cannot do this to your own family. You cannot put your father on the street." I looked down at the man sobbing at my feet. For 35 years I had desperately craved his approval. I had worked myself to the bone trying to prove that I was worthy of his love, that I was just as valuable as his golden daughter and her elite husband. But standing there looking at him groveling to protect his own selfish interests, I felt absolutely nothing. The little girl who wanted her father's love was completely gone. In her place was a woman who had built her own empire from the ground up. I gently but firmly pulled my jacket out of his trembling grasp. I took a step back, forcing him to look up at me. "When you stood in my driveway last week, Desmond," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy register. "When you stood there and watched my beautiful, innocent daughter scream in pure terror because your son-in-law brought thugs to my door to steal my property, did you remember that she was your blood? When you gladly handed over my obsolete routing numbers so Bradley could freeze my accounts and starve my child, did you remember, family?" Desmond flinched violently as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but no words came out. He just wept, shaking his head in pathetic denial. "When you used the money our mother left us to feed Maya's massive delusions of grandeur, did you remember, family?" I demanded. "You did not come here today as a father. You came here to oversee my execution. You sat in that boardroom and tried to help them steal my property, to cover up your own greed. You chose your side, Desmond. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." I turned away from him and looked at Maya. She was slumped against the reception desk, sobbing hysterically as the agents began to lead Bradley toward the elevator. Her perfect makeup was entirely ruined, running in dark streaks down her pale face. "Maya," I said, cutting through her sobs. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with absolute terror. "Do not forget what I told you. You have 48 hours to vacate the penthouse before my property managers arrive with the sheriff. I suggest you start packing your bags right now." I turned to Elias, nodding once. He pressed the elevator button and the door slid open. I walked inside, stepping past the federal agents and my former brother-in-law, who was staring at the floor in complete defeat. I pressed the button for the lobby. I looked out through the closing doors at the ruins of my family. Maya was screaming Bradley's name. Desmond was weeping on the floor, his hands covering his face in absolute shame. The pristine elite facade they had weaponized against me my entire life had been burned to ashes. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of their destruction. I took a deep breath of the quiet air, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I had walked into the lion's den and I had completely liquidated their empire. I was finally free. The descent to the ground floor felt entirely different from the ride up. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had sat on my chest for my entire life was gone, replaced by a profound weightlessness. When the silver doors slid open, I stepped out into the cavernous main lobby of the skyscraper. The morning sun was streaming through the three-story glass walls, casting long, bright geometric shadows across the pristine white marble. I walked toward the front exit, but a sudden commotion near the VIP security desk made me pause. I turned around, resting my hand against a cool stone pillar to watch the final act of the tragedy I had orchestrated. A secondary set of frosted glass elevator doors chimed loudly. They slid apart, revealing the spectacular ruin of Bradley Winston to the entire corporate world. The two federal agents marched him out into the open expanse of the lobby. The heavy steel handcuffs locked securely around his wrists caught the sunlight glinting brightly for every passing executive and security guard to see. Bradley's designer suit was rumpled, his silk tie hanging askew. The arrogant sneer that had permanently lived on his face was entirely gone. He kept his head bowed, his chin practically resting on his chest, attempting to hide his face from the dozen or so financial professionals who had stopped dead in their tracks to stare. The whispers started immediately echoing through the massive space. This was a man who had demanded total subservience from this building. He had belittled valets, screamed at receptionists, and strutted through this very lobby like a modern-day emperor. Now he was just a criminal being paraded through his own kingdom in chains. "Wait, my husband is not a criminal!" Maya's voice ripped through the hushed lobby, shattering the quiet professional atmosphere. She stumbled out of the elevator right behind the agents. The wide, cinematic view of the lobby captured her absolute pathetic desperation. The flawless elite socialite was completely unrecognizable. She had kicked off her expensive high heels, unable to run in them, and was chasing the federal agents barefoot across the cold marble floor. Her immaculate hair was tangled and wild. Black mascara ran in thick, dark streaks down her cheeks, staining her silk blouse. She threw herself forward desperately, trying to grab the sleeve of the lead FBI agent. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical wail that bounced off the high ceilings. "Do you know who we are? We live in Buckhead. We are investors. You have to let him go. We have money. We can pay whatever the fine is. Just tell me how much it is." The agent did not even break his stride. He smoothly sidestepped her frantic grasping motion, holding his arm out to keep a firm barrier between her and her husband. "Mom, if you interfere with a federal transport, you will be detained for obstruction," he warned, his voice echoing loudly enough for the entire lobby to hear. "Step back." Maya staggered, coming to a sudden halt. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, doubling over as a raw, animalistic sob tore from her throat. She looked wildly around the lobby, seeking a friendly face, a business partner, a sympathetic peer who would step in and save her from this nightmare. But the men and women in tailored suits simply backed away, averting their eyes or raising their phones to record the spectacle. In the world of high finance, a federal raid was a contagious disease. No one was going to step forward and risk catching the plague. "Bradley," Maya wailed, dropping to her knees on the hard stone floor. "Bradley, tell them to stop. Tell them to call the lawyers. Tell them about the trust funds." Bradley did not look back. He did not say a word to comfort his wife. He just kept his head down, letting the agents guide him through the revolving glass doors and out into the harsh reality of the police convoy waiting on the curb. He was leaving her to face the absolute devastation of their lives entirely alone. My gaze shifted back to the open elevator doors. My father was the last one to emerge. If Bradley looked like a defeated criminal, and Maya looked like a hysterical madwoman, Desmond looked like a walking corpse. He stepped out of the elevator, moving with the slow, mechanical stiffness of a man walking to the gallows. He had aged 20 years in the span of an hour. His broad shoulders were slumped forward, and his hands shook violently at his sides. He looked at Maya sobbing barefoot on the floor, but he did not go to her. He did not reach down to help his golden daughter stand up. He just stared blankly ahead, completely consumed by his own impending doom. He knew exactly what was coming. The FBI had Bradley. They had the hard drives, the ledgers, and the forged bridge loan documents. It was only a matter of time before they matched the signature on the fraudulent property lien to the ink on Desmond's desk. The righteous church elder, the man who had preached sermons on moral superiority and demanded absolute obedience from his family, was going to be indicted for a federal felony. He was going to lose his congregation, his massive estate, and his freedom. He was going to spend the final years of his life sleeping on a thin mattress in a federal penitentiary cell. Desmond slowly turned his head, his hollow, bloodshot eyes scanning the massive lobby. His gaze swept past the staring security guards and the whispering executives until it finally locked onto me. I was standing quietly by the marble pillar, my posture relaxed, my expression entirely serene. I did not offer him a smug smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor inspecting a worthless, liquidated asset. He was nothing to me anymore. The desperate need for his approval, the years of suffocating under his impossible standards, the agonizing pain of being constantly compared to Maya, it had all been completely excised from my soul. Desmond raised a trembling hand toward me, his mouth opening as if he wanted to speak. Perhaps he wanted to beg one last time. Perhaps he wanted to invoke God or family or blood. But the sheer distance between us, the unbridgeable chasm I had created, was too vast for his words to cross. He let his hand drop limply to his side, the ultimate physical admission of his total defeat. I held his gaze for one final second, making sure he saw the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. Then I turned around. I walked toward the heavy glass exit doors, the sharp rhythmic click of my heels cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby. I did not stop when Maya let out another wretched screaming sob. I did not pause when I heard the sirens of the federal convoy blazing to life on the street outside. I simply pushed through the heavy glass and stepped out into the blinding warmth of the morning sun. The city of Atlanta buzzed with life around me. Cars rushed past, the sidewalks were filled with people hurrying to their offices, and the sky above was a brilliant, endless blue. For my entire life, my family had tried to convince me that I was a failure. They had called me uneducated. They had mocked my business. They had tried to push me down into the dirt so they could stand on my shoulders and pretend they were giants, but they were not giants. They were just arrogant thieves wearing expensive suits and standing on a foundation of stolen money and forged signatures. I pulled my sunglasses from my tote bag, sliding them on as I walked toward my SUV. I had protected my daughter. I had secured my business. I had bought the very debt that would ensure my abusers spent the rest of their lives paying for what they had done. I unlocked my car, pulling open the door and climbing into the driver's seat. I started the engine, listening to the steady, reliable hum of the motor. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the flowing traffic, leaving the skyscraper, the federal agents, and the absolute ruin of the Winston family shrinking in my rearview mirror. I did not look back. I had an empire of my own to run. The frantic energy of that Monday morning eventually dissolved into the steady, quiet rhythm of justice taking its course. I sat in my office weeks later, the warm afternoon sun pouring through the glass windows and casting a golden glow across my desk. The storm had finally passed. Now came the meticulous, undeniable process of the American legal system sweeping up the wreckage of the Winston family. Bradley's staggering hubris had finally collided with the relentless machinery of the federal government. The FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission do not care about custom Italian suits or prestigious Buckhead addresses. They care about paper trails, and I had handed them an absolute masterpiece. Because wire fraud, operating an illegal Ponzi scheme, and elder financial exploitation carry severe mandatory minimums under federal sentencing guidelines, his high-priced defense attorney quickly realized they had absolutely no leverage. Bradley did not even make it to a trial. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence, he was forced to take a plea deal. The untouchable golden boy of Atlanta real estate wept openly in the courtroom when the federal judge handed down an 8-year sentence. There is no early parole in the federal prison system. He would serve every single day of those 8 years, stripped of his titles, his luxury cars, and his manufactured superiority. Furthermore, the court ordered massive financial restitution. Even when he eventually walked out of that penitentiary, his wages would be garnished for the rest of his natural life to pay back the investors he had defrauded. Maya's descent from high society was swift, brutal, and absolute. True to my word, the Fulton County Sheriff executed the eviction order that Friday morning. She was escorted out of her luxury penthouse lobby, clutching nothing but 2 suitcases of basic necessities, while her wealthy neighbors watched in stunned silence. The elite friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress scattered immediately, treating her sudden bankruptcy like a highly contagious disease. Her phone stopped ringing. The country club formally revoked her membership. With all of Bradley's remaining assets seized by the federal government to compensate his victims, Maya was left entirely destitute. She ended up renting a dingy, cramped motel room that charged by the week on the industrial outskirts of the city. The woman who had spent her entire life mocking my business as dirty and low class was forced to face the harsh reality of survival. She had to take a job working the cash register at a massive discount retail store just to keep the lights on. She now spent her days standing on aching feet wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scanning barcodes and bagging discounted merchandise for the exact kind of working-class people she had always looked down upon. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of wealth, and without it, she was completely hollow. My father faced a different kind of imprisonment. The moment the details of Bradley's federal indictment became public, the church board held an emergency closed-door meeting. They did not wait for a formal conviction. The mere public association with a massive financial fraud and the devastating revelation of his forged signature on a federal bank document was more than enough. Desmond was formally stripped of his title as a church elder and quietly but firmly asked to step down from the congregation entirely. The foreclosure on the Oakwood estate proceeded without a single hitch. My liquidation crews arrived on a Tuesday morning to change the locks and begin the methodical process of emptying the house. Desmond packed his few remaining personal items into his old sedan and drove away from the family legacy he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect. He moved into a small, subsidized apartment complex for seniors. The booming righteous patriarch, who had commanded respect from the pulpit for decades, was silenced forever. He was reduced to an isolated, disgraced old man, living on a meager, fixed income, with no congregation left to manipulate. For the first time in our family's history, there was no magical bailout. There was no rug large enough to sweep their colossal mistakes under, and no convenient scapegoat left to carry the blame. They had spent their entire lives building a toxic system where consequences were meant strictly for other people. They had firmly believed that their status made them immune to the rules that governed the rest of the world. But the law does not negotiate with delusions. I did not attend Bradley's sentencing hearing. I did not drive past Maya's motel or check on my father's subsidized apartment. I felt no lingering desire to gloat over their misery because my vindication was already complete. I had severed the invisible chains of guilt and obligation that had bound me to their toxicity since childhood. I focused all of my energy on expanding Vanguard liquidation and raising Chloe in a home filled with genuine, unconditional love. I taught my daughter that true success is never measured by the labels on your clothes or the zip code of your house, but by the integrity of your actions and the strength of your character. I had walked through the fire they set to destroy me, and I had emerged completely untouched. 6 months later, the scent of burning hickory wood and sweet caramelized barbecue sauce filled the warm afternoon air. The camera glides smoothly across the pristine emerald lawn of my new estate, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that mirrors the absolute tranquility of the day. The tracking shot drifts past the vibrant, blooming hydrangeas and captures the sparkling blue water of the infinity pool, where crystal-clear droplets catch the rich golden hour sunlight. Laughter rings out bright and unburdened. Chloe is running along the edge of the water, chasing a brightly colored beach ball and giggling uncontrollably. Elias stands in the shallow end, completely stripped of his usual rigid corporate armor. Wearing a casual linen shirt and sunglasses, he playfully splashes water in her direction, earning another joyful shriek from my daughter. She is entirely safe here. There are no thugs waiting in the driveway. There are no frantic calls from the bank. She is just a child, living exactly the way a child should. Near the outdoor stone kitchen stand the people who truly belong in my life, my lead investigators, my forensic accountants, and the legal partners who helped me secure the future of Vanguard liquidation are gathered around the grill. They are holding cold drinks, sharing stories, and treating me not as a lesser being, but as the respected architect of our shared success. There are no toxic relatives dissecting my appearance or questioning my choices. There are no condescending glares from a patriarch who demands absolute submission. There are no whispered insults from a sister terrified of my independence. In this sun-drenched backyard, there is only mutual respect, shared ambition, and the effortless warmth of people who genuinely want to see each other thrive. The smooth tracking shot finally comes to a gentle stop, focusing entirely on me. I am sitting comfortably in a woven patio chair, holding a glass of iced sweet tea. I watch my beautiful daughter leap into the pool without a single care in the world, and a deep, authentic smile spreads across my face. The heavy armor I had worn for 35 years has been permanently discarded. I look directly into the camera, breaking the fourth wall with absolute quiet confidence. In our culture, Black women are always taught to carry the burden. I say, my voice steady and unwavering. We are conditioned from birth to be the ultimate shock absorbers for everyone else's dysfunction. We are told to endure, to turn the other cheek, and to sacrifice unconditionally for family no matter how terribly they treat us. We are fed the lie that loyalty requires absolute submission to the very people who actively try to destroy us. I take a slow breath, feeling the gentle afternoon breeze against my skin. But I chose to break that curse. I learned the hard way that blood is nothing more than a biological accident. Sharing DNA does not give anyone a free pass to disrespect your boundaries, belittle your achievements, or threaten your child's safety. Real family is not defined by birth certificates or shared last names. Real family are the people who respect your mind, protect your peace, and celebrate your victories without a single toxic ounce of jealousy. They are the ones who stand beside you when the fire gets hot, not the ones who strike the match to burn you down. I look back at the pool, watching Elias high-five Chloe after she successfully catches the beach ball. If the people who are supposed to love you refuse to respect you, I continue looking back to the lens with crystal-clear conviction. If they demand you shrink yourself just to make them feel tall, and if they refuse to save you a seat at their exclusive table, do not beg for a spot. Do not wait for an invitation that will never come. Build your own table and only invite those who are worthy of pulling up a chair. I pause, letting the profound, peaceful truth of those words settle over the warm afternoon landscape. Have you ever had to slam the door on your own family to protect your peace? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to save yourself and your children? Share your story in the comments below. The sound of Chloe's laughter floats through the air one last time as the bright golden sunlight slowly begins to fade out into black.